Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not going to a battlefield, a medieval hovel, or a plague-ridden city street. Tonight, we're going somewhere far stranger, far more contradictory, and honestly far harder to explain: the private life of Michael Jackson. Not the headlines, not the documentaries, not the thing your coworker won't stop having opinions about. I mean the actual day-to-day reality of being the most famous human being who has ever lived, behind the gates, past the cameras, inside the rooms where nobody was supposed to see. So before you get comfortable, a quick thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you sent me down a rabbit hole I didn't fully emerge from for 3 days. If you enjoy what I do here, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I love knowing I'm keeping you company. The channel is also on Spotify now, so if you'd rather listen in the dark without a screen, the link is in the description. Now dim the lights, pull that blanket up, switch on the fan, and let's settle in. Before we begin, have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be Michael Jackson? What did he eat for breakfast? Did he sleep? Who did he call when everything got too loud? Did he walk around Neverland alone at 3 a.m. in a sequined glove? Or was that just something we assumed? What did he say to his chimpanzee? Was there a chimpanzee every single day, or just for special occasions? What did he do when no one was watching, in the hours between being a myth and being a man? Congratulations, you've just woken up at Neverland Ranch. The year is 1990. There's a full amusement park outside your window, a zoo operating at full capacity, and somewhere down the hallway, a man who's not had a normal Tuesday in approximately 30 years is deciding what to watch on television. Good luck making sense of any of this. Let's go back to the beginning, which is somehow the strangest place to start. Gary, Indiana, 1958. A 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street, which is, genuinely, the street he grew up on, as if the universe had already decided to be heavy-handed about it. Michael Joe Jackson is born the 7th of 9 children to Joseph Walter Jackson, a steel mill worker with a guitar and iron-fisted ambitions, and Catherine Screws, a Jehovah's Witness with a voice like a hymn. The house is cramped and loud, the neighborhood is working class, and Michael, from the moment he can walk, is already performing. Not because anyone asked him to, because he couldn't seem to stop. Gary, Indiana in the late 1950s, is not a soft place. The steel mills run day and night, painting the sky in shades of grey and amber, and the neighborhood around Jackson Street hums with the particular energy of a working-class community doing its level best. There are 9 children in 2 bedrooms, which, if you have ever shared a room with even one sibling, you understand is not a logistics problem, it is a full lifestyle. There is no privacy, no silence, and no such thing as your food. What there is, always, is music. Catherine plays piano and sings in the kitchen. Joe plays guitar after his shifts, and the children, arranged in a hierarchy of age and talent, absorb all of it the way dry earth absorbs rain. Completely, immediately, without remainder. Michael is not the oldest and not the youngest. He's somewhere in the middle, which in a family of 9 is essentially invisible, and yet he is not invisible. Even at 3 and 4 years old, the adults who visit the house notice him specifically. The way he watches the television when music plays, the way his body responds before his mind seems to have made a decision. His older brothers Jackie, Tito, Jermaine and Marlon are already rehearsing in the living room under Joe's direction. The rehearsals are not gentle. Joe Jackson believes in repetition the way other people believe in prayer, as a non-negotiable daily practice with consequences for lapse commitment. You miss a note, you hear about it. You miss your cue, you hear about it. You're 5 years old and you're already on the clock. Michael joins the rehearsals almost before he's asked. He watches his brothers, copies the steps, adds something to each copy that wasn't in the original, a little flick of the wrist, a pause that shouldn't work but does. Joe notices. This is, in its way, both the best and worst thing that could have happened to Michael Jackson. Being noticed by Joe meant being seen, which Michael craved. It also meant being held to a standard that had no ceiling and no off days. The Jehovah's Witness faith shapes the household too in ways that matter. No Christmas, no birthdays. Catherine raises the children with a devotion that is sincere and total. Michael absorbs this. He will carry a particular relationship to faith, to questions of purity and sin and divine judgment for the rest of his life. The boy growing up in Gary is already collecting contradictions, the father who demands perfection and frightens him, the mother who offers softness and spiritual structure, the brothers who are his competition and his closest companions, and somewhere underneath all of it, a talent so large it has nowhere to go except out. By 5 years old, Michael is performing publicly. By 7, he is the undisputed centre of attention in any room he enters. By 9, he'll be on a stage in front of thousands of people. But first, he's a child in a loud, cramped house in Gary, Indiana, watching the world through very large, very watchful eyes, and trying, already, to understand what he is. There is almost no way to talk about Michael Jackson without talking about his father, and almost no way to talk about his father without the conversation becoming uncomfortable quickly. Joseph Jackson is a complicated figure in the truest sense, a man who saw extraordinary talent in his children and extracted it through methods that left marks that never fully healed. Michael spoke about it rarely at first, then more openly as he got older, always with a kind of careful, grief-soaked restraint, as if he'd rehearsed the words so many times they'd worn smooth. The belt was real, the names were real, the fear was real. And so, unfortunately, was the result. 5 boys who could stop a room cold before any of them were teenagers. Joe Jackson worked at the steel mill. He came home tired, the way men who work with their bodies come home tired, bone deep, and with a particular quality of attention that is both very focused and very narrow. He had given up his own music career years earlier, and the guitar he played on weekends was the instrument of a man who knew exactly what had not happened. When he looked at his sons, he saw the route not taken, and he was not willing to watch them waste it. This is the charitable reading of Joe Jackson, and it is probably the accurate one. It does not make the rest of it easier to think about. Rehearsals in the Jackson household were mandatory, daily, and conducted under conditions that modern parents would recognize as a sports parent fever dream, taken approximately 10 steps further. You were expected to know your part. You were expected to hit it cleanly. If you did not, Joe would demonstrate the correct version, and then you would do it again. If you still did not, there were consequences. Michael described, in his 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, throwing up before performances because the anxiety was physical. He described seeing his father's face in the wings during shows and it changing something in how he performed, not unlocking him, but tightening him, which is a very specific kind of description for a very specific kind of fear. Joe also called Michael ugly. This is documented. He commented on his son's nose, his skin, the acne that developed in adolescence. Michael was one of the most beautiful children anyone had ever seen on a stage, and his father told him he was ugly and Michael heard it. You hear things your parents tell you at 7, 9, 11 in a register that sits below ordinary thought. It doesn't arrive as information. It arrives as weather. Michael spent the next several decades with access to every surgical technology available and unlimited funds, quietly and then not so quietly remaking his face. These events are connected. what is also true, and this is the part that makes Joe Jackson genuinely difficult to reduce to a single verdict, is that he was right about the talent. He saw it, and he pushed it into the world at a speed and with a force that the music industry, when it encountered the result, had no framework for. The Jackson 5 were extraordinary. Michael was extraordinary. Joe made that happen. The cost of it, to Michael, specifically, was also extraordinary. Michael never fully reconciled these two things. He spent years trying to construct a public position on his father that was honest without being a prosecution, and he largely failed, not because he wasn't articulate, but because the truth was genuinely contradictory, the love and the damage arriving from the same source, inseparable in the way that early wounds tend to be. When Joe Jackson was asked by an interviewer after Michael's death whether he felt any regret, he said he was proud of what he had built. He did not cry. Michael had spent 30 years trying to be understood. His father remained to the end someone who did not particularly feel the need to be. Imagine being 9 years old and having 20,000 people scream your name, not for something you did exactly, but for something you simply are. This inexplicable, almost alarming gift that lives inside your body and pours out the moment the music starts. That was Michael at 9, 10, 11. The Jackson 5 signed with Motown in 1969, and by the time I Want You Back hit the charts, the family from Gary had become something the music industry hadn't quite prepared for. A genuine phenomenon, wrapped in matching outfits, touring in buses, living in a world that bore almost no resemblance to the childhoods they'd left behind. Michael watched it happen from the inside, and even then, even that young, there was something in his eyes during interviews that looked less like joy and more like concentration. A child calculating how to hold on to something that moved very, very fast. The Motown deal came through Berry Gordy, who heard the boys audition and made a decision with the speed of someone who understood that this particular window was not going to stay open. The family relocated to Los Angeles, which is the kind of sentence that sounds clean and efficient, and is actually a complete disintegration of everything familiar. Gary, Indiana. Then Los Angeles. These are not adjacent experiences. The house, the neighborhood, the smell of the steel mill, the church, the school, gone. In their place, the Motown machine, which had its own rules, its own image consultants, its own ideas about what the Jackson 5 should be and how they should present themselves to the American public. You're 9 years old and you have a media trainer. The Motown formula was precise, songs were selected, stage movements were choreographed, interviews were managed. The boys were presented as wholesome, fun, and unthreatening. 5 brothers from a good family, clean-cut and smiling, entirely safe for consumption by the widest possible American audience in 1969, which required some careful navigation. It worked. I Want You Back went to number 1, ABC went to number 1, The Love You Save went to number 1, I'll Be There went to number 1, 4 consecutive number 1 singles from a group whose lead singer had not yet hit double digits. The machinery of popular music encountering Michael Jackson simply complied. What you don't see in the footage from this era, in the television appearances and the magazine covers and the concert films, is what happens after the cameras turn off. Michael and his brothers are children on the road in an adult industry. They see things. They hear things. Years later, Michael would describe the tours of this period in terms that were careful but pointed, not the concerts, which he loved with something close to physical need, but the margins around them, the adults, the hotels, the things that happen in the wings of an industry built on appetite. He also, during these years, simply does not have a childhood. This is not a metaphor. He does not go to school in any conventional sense. He does not have neighbours, local friends. the ordinary texture of a life lived in one place with familiar faces. What he has is performance, and more performance, and the road, and his brothers, and Joe in the wings, and the screaming, always the screaming, which is the sound of 20,000 people offering you something that feels like love and is actually a kind of consumption, and which a 9-year-old does not yet have the equipment to distinguish between the two. He will spend the rest of his life chasing that sound and trying to understand why it never quite filled the specific space it seemed designed to fill. By the late 1970s, Michael Jackson had spent his entire life as part of something else. The Jackson 5, the Jacksons, a family act, a Motown product, a boy in a matching suit, and then, in 1979, Quincy Jones and a recording studio in Los Angeles produced something that essentially hit the eject button on all of that. Off the wall was Michael at 21, finally given room to be an adult artist, and what emerged was, as many critics noted at the time, with some degree of disbelief, genuinely extraordinary. The album went platinum multiple times over, produced 4 top 10 singles, and established a version of Michael that the world had not previously been permitted to see. Sophisticated, sensual, joyful, in a way that felt real rather than performed. He was proud of it. He was also reportedly devastated when it didn't win the Grammy for Album of the Year. He filed that away and decided quietly to make something that couldn't be ignored. The Quincy Jones partnership is one of the more consequential creative collaborations in the history of 20th century music, and it began, as many extraordinary things do, somewhat accidentally. They had met on the set of The Wiz in 1977. Michael was acting, Quincy was musical director, and recognised in each other a shared pathology around craft that other people tended to find exhausting. Quincy Jones was 53 years old and had been in the music business long enough to be reasonably unsurprisable. Michael Jackson surprised him. He described in various interviews over the years the experience of watching Michael work in the studio as something distinct from working with other artists, a quality of attention, of relentlessness, of the refusal to accept a take that was merely very good when a perfect one might be available if you just tried 17 more times. Off the Wall is made in this spirit. The sessions are long. Michael arrives prepared in a way that studio musicians find slightly intimidating. He knows every part, has internalized every arrangement, and can demonstrate what he wants from the drums by beatboxing it with his mouth. He sings scratch vocals so clean they sometimes end up in the final mix. He dances in the recording booth between takes because standing still during the process is not a mode he can access. The album comes out and the world receives it warmly, very warmly. Platinum, tours, radio saturation. And yet the Grammy for Album of the Year goes somewhere else. And Michael sits with this fact in the particular way that extremely competitive people sit with failures, not loudly, not with visible distress, but with a very quiet, very total focus that looks from the outside like acceptance, and is in fact the opposite. He is 21 years old, he is already one of the most successful musicians alive, and he is, in his private accounting, behind where he needs to be. He begins making notes. He calls Quincy. They start discussing what comes next. The conversation that produces Thriller begins, in some sense, in the moment Michael Jackson learns he did not win the Grammy, which is either a wonderful story about the productive use of disappointment or a cautionary tale about a relationship with external validation that was already, at 21, operating at a clinical intensity. Probably it is both. Most true things about Michael Jackson turn out to be both. There are a handful of moments in the history of recorded music where something happens and the entire industry has to sit down and reassess what it thought was possible. 1982 was one of those moments. Thriller didn't just sell, it didn't just chart. It became, in a fairly short span of time, the best-selling album in history, a record it has more or less held ever since, depending on who's counting and how generously you define the category. 7 singles, 7 top 10 hits from a single album. A 14-minute short film for the title track that MTV aired as a special event, and that people gathered around television sets to watch the way previous generations had gathered to watch the moon landing. Michael watched the world react from behind the gates of a rented Encino estate, eating cereal, wearing a single glove, and thinking about what to do next. The making of Thriller is a story about refusing to stop when a reasonable person would stop. The album takes shape over many months in Los Angeles, and the sessions have a quality that engineers and session musicians who were present describe with a consistency that is either a tribute to their collective memory or evidence that the experience was genuinely singular. Michael does not sleep the way other people sleep. He works at night, arrives at decisions that seem to come from somewhere below conscious deliberation, and then executes them with a technical precision that is entirely conscious. Billie Jean is written essentially whole. Michael claims the bass line came to him fully formed, walking somewhere in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon. He recorded his guide vocal in one take. Producers wanted to alter the mix. Michael refused. The bass line you hear on the final record is the bass line exactly as Michael Jackson heard it in his head before a single instrument was played. He is equally specific about everything else. The length of the pause before a lyric, the texture of a backing vocal, the exact degree of echo on a drum hit. Quincy Jones, who has worked with Miles Davis and Frank Sinatra and has essentially seen everything, describes Michael during Thriller as the most perfectionist collaborator he has ever encountered. This is said with admiration, and also with the mildly haunted quality of someone describing a natural force they were glad to be adjacent to rather than in the path of. Then there is the video, the Thriller short film directed by John Landis featuring zombie choreography that required weeks of rehearsal, with a runtime that at 14 minutes had no precedent in the format, cost $500,000, an obscene amount for a promotional vehicle in 1983, and MTV, which had famously been reluctant to air black artists at all, not only airs it but treats it as a broadcast event. The making of documentary becomes its own product. Vinyl copies of the album sell in patterns that cause record stores to run out of stock on the day of release and then run out again. By 1984, Thriller has sold 30 million copies. By the time it finally stops being counted, the number will be north of 66 million. Michael Jackson is 24 years old. He has made the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. He is standing at the absolute apex of what is achievable in his industry. He is also, by several accounts, already worried it might not be enough. And this, not the success, but the specific quality of anxiety underneath the success, is the thing that will define everything that comes next. Every element of Michael Jackson's visual identity was to some degree deliberate, even the parts that appeared spontaneous. The sequined glove appeared on one hand, not two, which was the kind of specific asymmetry that makes a stylist weep and a cultural historian write 3 dissertations: the fedora, the military jackets, the ankle-bearing pants that showed white socks, which nobody else in the history of fashion had managed to make significant, and yet. And then the moonwalk, performed on national television in May of 1983 during a Motown anniversary special, a movie so clean and so inexplicable to the physics-abiding human eye that the switchboard at NBC lit up immediately. Michael had been working on it in private. He'd learned the general technique from street dancers and spent months refining it until it looked less like a dance move and more like a demonstration that gravity had agreed to make an exception for one specific person. The single glove appears first in public around 1983, and its origin story is, like most origin stories for genuinely strange choices, partly practical and partly something else. Michael had developed a skin condition on one hand. He wore the glove to cover it. Then the glove became the image. Then the image became a symbol. Then the symbol became so thoroughly associated with him that a single bedazzled glove in a museum case makes people stop walking and look the way religious objects do. The lesson, if there is one, is that context and confidence transform almost any object into meaning. Or it is that Michael Jackson's particular genius for presentation was so thorough that he could make a dermatological accommodation into one of the most recognizable fashion statements in the history of human clothing. Either way, the military jackets come from a sensibility that was always more eclectic than people understood. Michael was an omnivorous consumer of visual culture. He studied film, painting, the history of performance, the costumes of Barnum and Bailey, the dress uniforms of actual military traditions. He found the silhouette of a military jacket, the epaulets, the strong shoulders, the rows of brass buttons, both beautiful and useful as a theatrical device, something that communicated authority and grandeur without requiring a crown or a throne. He had about 50 of them made, each variation on the same essential concept, and wore them in a rotation that was tracked by no one and noticed by everyone. The ankle-length trouser is more mysterious. It defies easy explanation. It simply revealed the white sock, which contrasted with the dark shoes, which drew the eye downward to exactly the level at which the footwork happened. Whether this was calculated or instinctive is a question that depends on how much you believe in the possibility of unconscious genius, and Michael Jackson's case makes a compelling argument for believing in it quite a lot. And then there is the moonwalk itself, performed on stage at the Motown 25th anniversary television special during Billie Jean. Michael slides backward across the stage while appearing to walk forward, and the audience, which contains some of the most experienced music industry professionals alive, makes a sound that is not quite screaming and not quite gasping, and is perhaps the sound of several hundred people's concept of physical possibility being revised in real time. Backstage afterward, Fred Astaire, who was there, because of course Fred Astaire was there, reportedly called Michael and told him what he had seen. Michael kept the note. In 1988, Michael Jackson purchased a 2,700-acre property in the Santa Ynez Valley near Santa Barbara and named it Neverland, after the place in J.M. Barrie's story where children never had to grow up, which tells you everything and nothing simultaneously. There was a Ferris wheel, there was a roller coaster, there was a zoo with giraffes, an elephant named Gypsy, and yes, a chimpanzee named Bubbles, who occupied a level of cultural prominence usually reserved for heads of state. There were flower-lined paths, a train that circled the property, a movie theatre, a fire station with a working fire engine staffed by actual firefighters, and a house at the centre of it all that contained one of the most famous and most solitary people on the planet, moving through rooms decorated with Peter Pan imagery and trying to get a decent night's sleep. You have to stand inside the concept of Neverland for a moment before you evaluate it, because the evaluation goes very differently depending on where you're standing. To the outside world, it looked immediately and obviously like either a monument to arrested development or something more sinister. A fully operational amusement park on private land, owned by a 40-year-old man, open to children. To Michael, it was, by his own account, the childhood he had never had, reconstructed at scale and made available to anyone who needed it. He invited terminally ill children from hospitals. He invited underprivileged kids from local communities. He walked through his own amusement park and rode his own roller coaster and ate cotton candy and seemed, by every account from people who were present, to experience something genuine, a lightness that the rest of his life did not frequently provide. The property cost somewhere between $17 and $19 million to purchase and required approximately $5 million per year to maintain at full operation. This is not a detail. This is the central economic fact of the second half of Michael Jackson's life. Neverland is too expensive to sustain, too personally significant to close, and too publicly associated with the worst accusations ever made against him to simply be what he originally intended. After the 1993 allegations and the 2003 arrest, the ranch is searched by police, stripped of several of its contents as potential evidence, and never quite the same again. Michael stops living there after the trial. He returns briefly, once, with friends who describe the experience as heartbreaking. The amusement park rides unmaintained, the animals relocated, the flower beds overgrown, the movie theatre dark. He stands in the middle of it and is quiet for a long time. There are no accounts of what he said because the people who were with him understood that this was not a moment that required comment. Neverland sells in 2019, 10 years after Michael's death, to a music executive who renames it and begins converting it into a private estate. The roller coaster is dismantled, the zoo is long gone. What remains is the land, the house, and the very specific silence of a place that was built to contain joy and outlasted its builder by a decade. Let's talk about Bubbles, because Bubbles requires talking about. Michael Jackson acquired a baby chimpanzee from a Texas research facility in the early 1980s and proceeded to raise him with an attention to detail that many pediatricians would have found excessive. Bubbles had his own bedroom at Neverland. He was taken on tour. He was dressed in matching outfits with Michael for photographs that were then distributed to the global press, seemingly without anyone in Michael's camp considering that this might generate questions. He drank tea from a porcelain cup. He met the mayor of Osaka. In interviews, Michael described Bubbles with the warmth and pride typically reserved for discussions of one's children. And if you found this baffling, Michael seemed to find your confusion equally baffling, because the chimpanzee was simply his companion, and if that required some explanation on your part, that was rather your problem. The logic of Bubbles, once you spend a moment with it, is actually fairly coherent, which is somehow the most unsettling thing about it. Michael Jackson was one of the most famous people on earth. He could not walk through a public space without generating a response so extreme it functioned as a kind of physical barrier between himself and the world. He did not trust people easily, with good historical reason. He wanted companionship. He wanted something that looked at him without agenda, without want, without the particular calculation that accompanied almost every human interaction at his level of celebrity. Bubbles looked at him and saw, by all accounts, a person who gave him food and scratched him behind the ears and seemed genuinely glad he was there. This is, when you think about it, not that different from the reason anyone gets a dog. Michael just escalated the concept. Bubbles travelled in his own seat on airplanes. He was provided with a handler whose full-time job was the well-being of a single chimpanzee. He was toilet-trained, which is the detail that somehow lands hardest. The image of someone at Neverland patiently undertaking this particular educational enterprise on behalf of their employer and a primate. Bubbles attended business meetings. He was photographed with world leaders. He was, briefly, more photographed than most working musicians. The Japanese press during the bad tour was particularly taken with Bubbles. The mayor of Osaka received him in an official capacity. Bubbles, for his part, appears to have been equable about the whole arrangement. The footage from this period shows a chimpanzee who's been socialized almost entirely by humans and who navigates the human world with a kind of resigned competence, like someone doing a job they did not choose but have decided to do well. Bubbles was eventually relocated to an animal sanctuary in Florida in 2003. When he reached an age at which chimpanzees become less compatible with domestic arrangements and considerably more powerful than their human companions. He is, as of the time of this writing, still alive. He paints. His paintings sell. He is, by the accounts of his keepers, happy, which is either a perfect ending to a very strange story or a detail that requires more unpacking than a sleep channel can reasonably provide at this hour. Michael Jackson's changing appearance is one of the most discussed, most debated and most speculated about subjects in the history of celebrity culture, and it remains so largely because the full truth of it sits somewhere in a space that is part medical record, part performance art, and part something that resists clean categorization. What is documented? Multiple rhinoplasties. What is documented and frequently dismissed? Vitiligo, a condition that causes loss of skin pigmentation in patches, which Michael was diagnosed with, and which he discussed in his 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, with visible emotion. What is also documented? A man who spent decades in the most scrutinized body on earth, who was called ugly by his father as a child, who watched his face become one of the most recognized images in human history, and who seemed to find in cosmetic alteration some attempt at authorship over the one thing that had always been discussed by other people. The nose is the most visible part of the story and also in some ways the least interesting. Michael had his first rhinoplasty in the early 1980s, following a broken nose during a rehearsal. The first surgery leads to a second. The second leads to a third. By the end, the nose is structurally compromised in ways that required medical management, cartilage damage, scar tissue, the complications of too many procedures on a single small structure. This is not a mystery. It is what happens when surgery becomes habitual, which is itself not a mystery if you understand anything about the psychology of body dysmorphia, in a person who was told, at an age when such things root themselves permanently, that their face was wrong. The vitiligo is real and documented. Dermatologists who treated Michael have confirmed the diagnosis. The lightening of his skin was not entirely surgical. Depigmentation treatments exist and are used by people with vitiligo to even out the patches, creating a uniform lightness rather than a patchwork appearance. This is a medical choice, not an aesthetic conspiracy. It is also, for a black man in America in the 1980s and 90s, politically complicated in ways that Michael never fully addressed and the public never fully absorbed, preferring the cleaner, crueler narrative of a man who wanted to be white. What Michael was actually doing, insofar as anyone can say with certainty, was attempting to exercise control over a body that had been commented on, displayed, dissected and discussed by other people for his entire life. When you have never owned the image of yourself, when it has always been Motown's image, or the media's image, or the public's image, the desire to get your hands on it and change it becomes comprehensible in a way that the results sometimes are not. He was building a face, whether it was the face he saw when he closed his eyes, or the face that represented freedom from the one he'd been given, or simply the next iteration in a process he had long since lost the ability to stop. Nobody who loved him seems to have been able to determine, including perhaps Michael himself. Here is something that surprises people. Michael Jackson was, by most accounts of those who worked closely with him, enormously disciplined about his craft and somewhat chaotic about everything else. His days at Neverland often began very late. He was a night person by nature and by necessity, someone who did his best creative thinking in the small hours when the world had finally quieted enough to think. He would watch films, often the same films repeatedly, with a particular devotion to classic cinema and Disney animation. He read voraciously, biographies, art books, books on history and architecture. He sketched ideas for music videos in notebooks. He called musicians and collaborators at 2 a.m. with ideas that needed to be recorded immediately. He ate, reportedly, with the focused minimalism of someone who regarded meals as a minor administrative task rather than a pleasure. The sleep problem runs through every decade of his adult life like a river that is always there, always low. Michael Jackson did not sleep well. This is not a euphemism. He found it genuinely difficult to cross the threshold into unconscious rest, and the reasons for this are probably multiple and overlapping. the anxiety that is the long residue of a childhood spent performing under threat, the hypervigilance of someone who has been watched and discussed his entire life, the specific difficulty of turning off a brain that operates at the pitch Michael's operated at. He tried various remedies over the years: meditation, reading, films at 3 a.m. in his private theatre, alone or with whichever staff member had the overnight shift and was willing to watch The Elephant Man for the 4th time that week. He was a reader in the serious accumulative sense. His personal library at Neverland contained thousands of books, and staff reported that they were not decorative. He had a particular interest in biographies of historical figures: Napoleon, Lincoln, Gandhi, the Kennedys, and in the mechanics of fame and legacy, which is either a natural interest for someone in his position or a slightly too-on-the-nose detail. He read art history extensively. He visited galleries wearing disguises which worked imperfectly and required significant logistical coordination, but which he continued doing because the alternative was not going at all, and not going was apparently worse. The food is the part that draws raised eyebrows from nutritionists. Michael ate sparingly, with strong preferences that drifted over the years from vegetarianism towards simply very light eating. Former staff described meals that were small, carefully arranged and consumed quickly, as though eating were something to be dealt with between more important activities. He had a well-documented fondness for fried chicken in later years, which he shared with his children, and which represented, in some small way, the Gary, Indiana part of himself that no amount of celebrity had quite succeeded in remodeling. His relationship with time was its own phenomenon. He was, by most accounts, chronically late, not in the passive-aggressive sense, but in the sense of someone who became genuinely absorbed in whatever he was doing and lost track of hours the way ordinary people lose track of minutes. Recording sessions that were scheduled for noon began at 9 in the evening. Meetings were rescheduled again and again with such consistency that his management eventually built buffer time into every arrangement. The world waited for Michael Jackson routinely and seemed to find this acceptable, which is either a testament to his talent or a testament to what happens when no one has ever successfully said no to someone since approximately 1969. Michael Jackson's social circle was, to put it diplomatically, unconventional. His closest friends were not the people you might expect proximity to generate, not fellow musicians, not people in his immediate industry orbit, but rather a selection of individuals who occupied their own peculiar relationship to fame, myth, and the more vertiginous altitudes of celebrity. Elizabeth Taylor, who had been a child star herself, who understood the specific disorientation of having never known ordinary life, became one of his closest companions. Marlon Brando, who had similarly retreated from the world into an estate on Mulholland Drive and a private island in French Polynesia, was another. They were, in a sense, a support group for people whose fame had long since ceased to feel like anything a human being could be expected to metabolize normally. Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson met in the early 1980s and recognized each other immediately with the particular speed of people who share a condition for which there is no general public diagnosis. She had been photographed since she was 9 years old. She had been married 8 times. She had been declared dead by the press on 2 separate occasions and had recovered from both with a composure that suggested she had simply decided not to accept the premise. When Michael needed someone to talk to who would understand, not sympathize, not analyze, but actually understand, he called Elizabeth Taylor. She answered. They spoke for hours. She is one of perhaps 3 or 4 human beings in the entire span of his adult life who he seems to have trusted without significant qualification. Marlon Brando was a different kind of company. By the time their friendship deepened in the 1990s, Brando was living in magnificent, deliberate seclusion, enormous, philosophical, completely unbothered by the world's opinion, in a way that Michael found both admirable and slightly enviable. They talked about fame and its discontents with the candour of two people who had nothing left to prove to each other. Brando was also reportedly a formidable eater who enjoyed being at Neverland in part because the kitchen was well stocked and no one disturbed him. He once ate an entire meal intended for several people and seemed satisfied with this outcome. There was also Macaulay Culkin, the friendship with whom generated a considerable amount of speculation and very little of what you would call clarity. They met when Michael was working on music videos and Culkin was the most famous child in Hollywood. They were, for several years, genuinely close, playing together at Neverland, talking on the phone, sharing the specific bewilderment of people whose childhoods had been conducted entirely in public. Culkin has spoken about the friendship in terms that are warm and uncomplicated. Michael spoke about it the same way. The rest of the world found this information difficult to receive without editorial comment, which was the world's problem to manage and not always successfully managed. What these friendships share, Taylor, Brando, Culkin, a handful of others, is the quality of being conducted outside the ordinary social grammar. These were not friendships built through proximity or convenience or shared professional context. They were chosen with care and maintained with a loyalty that was, in each case, reciprocated. Michael Jackson was, in the private register, by accounts that converge from multiple directions, an attentive and generous friend who remembered things people told him months earlier, who sent gifts with unusual precision, and who called to check on people with a consistency that surprised them every time. He was also, in that same private register, sometimes a great deal of work, needy in the specific way that enormously talented people whose every need has been met by infrastructure can be needy, which is less about volume and more about intensity. His friends stayed anyway. This is, in the end, the simplest thing you can say about the quality of Michael Jackson as a friend. The people who knew him best kept choosing to. Michael Jackson's vocal instrument is one of the more fascinating technical objects in popular music, and it is worth pausing to consider it with some care rather than simply accepting it as a given the way you might accept gravity or the existence of Tuesday. He was a boy soprano of unusual power and control, the kind of voice that stops adults in a room and makes them look up from whatever they're doing. As he matured, rather than experiencing the relatively clean vocal break that most male singers navigate, Michael developed what many vocal coaches describe as an extraordinarily rare ability to move between registers with near seamless fluidity. The falsetto, the grunt, the hiccup, the scream that functions as musical punctuation. These were not accidents. They were techniques, studied and refined over decades, deployed with the precision of a surgeon who also happened to be extraordinarily moved by what he was cutting. The boy soprano voice is the starting point, and it is worth registering just how remarkable it was. When Michael Jackson sings lead on I Want You Back at 11 years old, the technical qualities of the performance are not those of a child doing something impressive for his age. They are those of a fully formed interpretive vocalist who happens to also be in 5th grade. The phrasing, the timing, the understood weight on specific syllables, these are not things that can be taught, at least not at that speed. Quincy Jones, who worked with him 20 years later, said the adult Michael was, vocally, the same animal as the child Michael, just with more range, more control, and a considerably more sophisticated understanding of what to do with the silence between notes. The falsetto is the element that most singers study and most cannot replicate. Michael's falsetto is not the strained, slightly panicked sound that marks the falsetto of most male voices pushed past their natural ceiling. It is warm, it is controlled, and it is located exactly where he places it, not where the voice breaks and falls into a higher register, but where he decides to go. The transition is, at its best moments, inaudible. You're in the chest voice, and then you are in the falsetto, and the seam between them is gone. the way a skilled painter makes the seam between two colours disappear. The hiccup, the small rhythmic catch in the vocal line that appears throughout his recorded work, is often described as a quirk, which undersells it considerably. It is a rhythmic device. It operates as punctuation. It disrupts the expected line of a melody in the same way that a jazz musician might place a note slightly off the beat, creating a tension that the ear immediately and pleasurably resolves. Michael understood this. He placed it deliberately. Producers who tried to edit it out of tracks in early mixes were instructed to put it back. He was also, and this is the part that gets lost in discussions of the vocal gymnastics, genuinely moving as a singer in the old-fashioned sense. He communicated feeling, which is the actual job, underneath all the technique. When he sings She's Out of My Life in the studio, reportedly crying at the end of multiple takes because the song affected him genuinely, each time he is not performing emotion, he is having it. The technique was not a wall between Michael and the material, it was the vehicle, and the vehicle, across 4 decades of recorded work, remained one of the most distinctive in the history of the form. The rehearsal footage that exists for Michael Jackson's tours is the kind of material that makes even people who do not particularly love performance art sit forward slightly in their chairs. It is the footage of someone for whom the word enough did not seem to exist in any functional sense. For the Bad World Tour, for Dangerous, for the ill-fated This Is It rehearsals, the documentation is the same. A man who had already performed these songs for the equivalent of several lifetimes arriving at a warehouse or a rehearsal stage and beginning again, from the beginning, as if the previous 40 years of his career were a rough draft. He corrected backup dancers mid-run. He stopped full band rehearsals to ask about a specific snare sound. He watched playback of his own performances with a detached critical eye of a director who's never quite found the version he was looking for. The rehearsal day began when Michael decided it began, which was not always when the schedule said it would begin, and occasionally with significant divergence between the two. Dancers who were called for 10 in the morning learned quickly that this was aspirational notation. The actual start time had a relationship to the scheduled start time that could best be described as approximate. When Michael did arrive, however, the drift of the previous several hours was instantly replaced by something else entirely. A focus so complete it had a physical quality, like a change in air pressure. He warmed up quietly. He did not perform the warm-up. This is a distinction that matters, because there were people in Michael Jackson's life who performed at all times as a kind of default state, and he was not one of them in rehearsal. In rehearsal, he was technical, specific, and sometimes blunt in a way that his public persona gave no indication of. A dancer executing a move incorrectly was told, clearly and without cushioning, that it was incorrect. He would demonstrate the correct version, once, usually, with a precision that made the problem immediately obvious, and then expect it to be fixed. The combination of the demonstration and the expectation was, by accounts of dancers who toured with him, both the most instructive and most demanding thing they had ever encountered professionally. The This Is It footage captured during rehearsals for the London concerts in the months before his death is the most complete record of this process that exists, and it is complicated viewing. Michael is 50 years old. He's working with the same intensity, the same specificity, the same refusal to accept adequate when precision is available. He stops a rehearsal run of They Don't Care About Us because the tempo is slightly off, and demonstrates the correct tempo by singing it himself, a cappella, in an empty rehearsal space, at the level of commitment most performers reserve for the actual show. The director of the concert film captures his face during playback watching himself. It is the face of someone doing arithmetic. He was, in those final rehearsals, also careful with his instrument in a way that suggested awareness of its limits, marking vocals rather than singing full out, conserving the voice for performance. His choreographer and longtime collaborator Travis Payne noted that even at the reduced intensity of a marked vocal, the performance quality was what most people's full effort looked like. This was both reassuring and not reassuring at all, depending on which part of the sentence you attended to most. In January of 1984, Michael Jackson was filming a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles when pyrotechnic sparks set his hair on fire. He did not immediately realize what was happening. He kept performing for a few seconds, an image that is both genuinely heroic and genuinely terrible to contemplate before crew members ran onto the set. He was taken to hospital with second-degree burns to his scalp. The incident required treatment for what was described as a 4-inch patch of burned skin, and the surgery that followed introduced Michael Jackson, reportedly for the first time, to painkillers. The settlement with Pepsi was donated to charity. The long-term consequences of that introduction to analgesics are documented in ways that are difficult to read and impossible to reverse. You are on a set. You're 25 years old and the most famous musician alive. There are cameras everywhere, not metaphorically, literally, because this is a commercial shoot with a production budget that most feature films of the era would have found aspirational. Pyrotechnics fire on cue. You descend a staircase with the particular quality of movement that is just Michael Jackson walking, which is already somehow more than other people walking, and then there is fire in your hair, and you do not know it yet because the sensation has not quite arrived, and the performance instinct, which has been running your body since you were 5 years old, keeps you in the scene for a few more seconds that everyone watching will later describe as very hard to watch. The burn is serious. The scalp wound requires surgery. The surgery requires anesthesia and post-operative pain management. The pain management requires opioids. This sequence of events, each step of which is medically unremarkable in isolation, is one of the more consequential chains of causation in the history of popular music, and the cruelty of it, that it begins with a commercial for a soft drink, on a set with a full safety crew, during what should have been a routine shoot, is the kind of irony that loses its quality as irony and becomes simply something that happened. Michael established a clinic, the Michael Jackson Burn Center, at the Brotman Medical Center in Los Angeles, with his Pepsi settlement. He donated the entire amount, $1.5 million. He never discussed the incident publicly in terms of grievance. He was characteristically, almost disquietingly, gracious about something that had altered the arc of his life in ways that would not be fully visible for years. The painkiller dependency that develops in the following years is not a straight line. It is interrupted by periods of sobriety, by rehabilitation, by the interventions of people who cared about him, and by the counter-interventions of people who needed him functional and were not always careful about the method. He checks himself into a rehabilitation facility in 1993 under circumstances that are managed very carefully by his team and reported on very heavily by the press. He speaks about addiction with a directness that surprises his audience. He describes the dependency as a genuine illness. He is right about that, and the world briefly takes him at his word. Then time passes and the world, as it does, moves on to the next thing. The dependency does not move on. It waits, with the patience that dependencies tend to have for the next opening. Here is a problem that has no clean solution. You have made the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. You are now expected to make another one. The album that followed Thriller was bad, released in 1987, and by any objective measure it was a staggering commercial success. 5 number-1 singles from a single album, a record that still stands, tours that sold out stadiums on multiple continents. By any other measure, it was also the beginning of a story about what happens when the world decides your previous achievement was not a high watermark, but a baseline. Michael reportedly worked on Bad with an intensity that concerned the people around him, recording for long stretches without sleeping, scrapping tracks that most artists would have released without hesitation, second-guessing decisions that Quincy Jones considered settled. He wanted 9 number-1 singles. He got 5. He was by several accounts briefly inconsolable. The gap between Thriller and Bad is 5 years, which in 1980s pop music is roughly the geological equivalent of an ice age. Michael used the time. He spent it on film. Thriller is 1982, but the full weight of his investment in short-form visual storytelling is concentrated in the mid-80s, culminating in the Captain EO film for Disney theme parks, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, running 17 minutes, costing $30 million, and featuring Michael Jackson defeating an evil alien queen through the power of music and elaborate choreography. It is one of the more specific uses of $30 million in the history of cinema, and Michael was reportedly delighted with it. The Bad sessions are longer and more difficult than the Thriller sessions by every account. The gap between what the album needed to be, which was, by industry logic and Michael's own internal accounting, as good as Thriller, and what any album made by a human being could reasonably be, is not a gap that can be closed by working harder. Michael works harder anyway. He and Quincy Jones cycle through dozens of tracks, finishing some, abandoning others, returning to abandoned ones and finishing those too. The track listing of Bad contains material that would have anchored any other artist's career: Man in the Mirror, The Way You Make Me Feel, Dirty Diana, I Just Can't Stop Loving You. These are not consolation prizes. The world receives Bad warmly, enormously warmly by any reasonable standard. The tour is the largest grossing concert tour in history to that point. Michael performs for 4.5 million people across 16 countries. The shows are, by accounts of everyone who sees them, staggering. He is 30 years old, at the peak of his physical capability, in possession of a stage presence that has no direct equivalent, and he uses all of it every night. And yet he is already calculating what the next album has to be. He is already aware that the world has revised its expectations upward to a point where matching them is, in the strictest sense, impossible. He files this away and keeps working. The specific texture of Michael Jackson's creative drive is not ambition in the ordinary sense. It is closer to a hunger that is never satisfied by eating, not because the food isn't good, but because the hunger itself is structural. 5 number-1 singles. 5. And somewhere in a hotel room on the Bad tour, the most successful touring musician alive sits with that number and finds it, quietly, insufficient. The 1991 album Dangerous was the first album Michael Jackson made without Quincy Jones as producer, and the fact that he made it at all, given the magnitude of what that partnership had produced, tells you something about his particular brand of creative courage. Or stubbornness. Both, probably. He worked instead primarily with Teddy Riley and Bill Bottrell, pushing toward a sound that incorporated New Jack Swing, hip-hop influences, and a harder percussive edge that reflected a world that had changed considerably since 1982. He also began writing more explicitly political material: Black or White, Heal the World, Will You Be There? Songs that showed a man trying to use his fame as a kind of argument for something, though exactly what that argument was shifted depending on which track you were listening to. The end of the Quincy Jones collaboration is not a dramatic rupture. There is no documented falling out, no public statement of severance. It is more that Michael has spent a decade and a half working inside a creative partnership that, while genuinely extraordinary, is also a partnership, and a partnership means, by definition, that someone else has a vote. By the early 90s, Michael wants sole authorship over the direction of his work in a way that the Quincy relationship structurally could not provide. This is not a criticism of the decision. It is a description of the particular stage of an artist who has mastered the grammar of collaboration and needs now to test what he is without it. Teddy Riley is the right call for the moment. New Jack Swing is the dominant sound of Black American popular music in 1991, and Riley is its architect. The combination of Riley's rhythmic sensibility and Michael's melodic instinct produces the first half of Dangerous, tighter, harder, and more self-consciously contemporary than anything Michael has released since Off the Wall. Jam, the opening track, features Michael rapping, not well, not badly, but with the conviction of someone who has decided this is what the song requires and is not interested in qualifications. The second half of the album tilts the other direction entirely. Expansive, orchestral, explicitly moral. Heal the World, which Michael identified as his favourite of all his own songs, is a ballad of such unembarrassed sincerity that it requires a particular disposition to receive without irony. Michael had that disposition completely. He was not performing the sentiment. He believed, in the most literal and uncomplicated sense, that music could change the world, that if you could make someone feel something true for 4 minutes, that feeling would persist and accumulate and eventually add up to something that mattered. This belief is either beautiful or naive, and the distinction may not be as clear as it appears. Dangerous ships 32 million copies. The world tour that follows is the first to feature the full theatrical apparatus that becomes synonymous with Michael Jackson live, the pneumatic stage lifts, the elaborate costume changes, the integration of cinema-scale visual effects into a concert context. It is, by every technical measure, the most ambitious touring production the industry has seen. It is also the last tour before the world changes for Michael, in a way that cannot be undone by ambition or craft, or the sheer accumulated force of what he has already made. On February 10th, 1993, Oprah Winfrey sat down with Michael Jackson at Neverland Ranch for what became one of the most watched television interviews in American history, approximately 90 million viewers, a number that still makes modern broadcasters feel a complicated mixture of emotions. Michael had not given a major television interview in 14 years. He addressed the vitiligo, he addressed the surgeries, he addressed his childhood, carefully, and the visible flinch he suppressed when Oprah asked about his father told you more than the words did. He showed her around Neverland with a kind of nervous pride that was hard to watch without some feeling, because he so clearly wanted someone to look at the thing he had built and understand it, rather than find it alarming. For one evening, more or less, the world seemed to try. The decision to do the interview is itself significant. Michael has spent 14 years refusing access of this kind. Controlled images, authorized photographs, but no unscripted conversation, no questions he hasn't been told are coming. He changes course in 1993 for reasons that are partly strategic, and partly, it seems, more personal than that. He wants to speak. He has things he wants said, and he has reached a point where the controlled image has become its own kind of cage, the myth of Michael Jackson, so thoroughly crowding out the actual person that even people who consider themselves his fans seem to be fans of a symbol rather than a human being. He chooses Oprah because she is, at this point, the safest conversational partner available to him in terms of guaranteed audience, and the least likely to ambush him. He's partially right about this. The vitiligo conversation is the moment the interview turns from interesting to genuinely affecting. Michael says, quietly and directly, that he has a skin disorder that destroys skin pigmentation in patches and that there is nothing he can do about it. It is not a choice, it is a medical condition, and he would never bleach his skin. That would be foolish. He says it with a composure that reads less as calm and more as someone who has rehearsed the sentence many times because he knows, from long experience, that the world requires a composed delivery in order to hear the content. Oprah receives it carefully. the viewing audience in the moment seems to receive it. In the subsequent decades, the world more or less reverts to its previous position. But for those 90 seconds, there is a man saying something true about himself and being heard. The tour of Neverland is the other image that stays. Michael walks Oprah through the ranch with the eagerness of someone showing you something they made themselves. The amusement rides, the animals, the flowers. He is 44 years old. He rides a ride and laughs in the specific, unguarded way of a person who has momentarily forgotten that 90 million people are watching. Oprah, to her credit, does not editorialize. She watches him. She lets the image be what it is. What it is clearly is a man who built himself a world because the existing world had not, at any point in his life, had room for him as he actually was. You can find this sad, or you can find it extraordinary, or you can find it both, and the interview does not tell you which you should find it. It just shows you the man in his world for a few minutes, being approximately himself. In the summer of 1993, Jordan Chandler, a 13-year-old boy whose family had become close to Michael Jackson over the previous months, made allegations of sexual abuse. The resulting investigation consumed the following 18 months of Michael's life, generated a civil lawsuit that settled out of court for approximately $23 million. A settlement Michael maintained was made without admission of wrongdoing and against his own wishes, and produced a criminal investigation that ultimately resulted in no charges being filed. The damage to his public image was, by any metric, severe and lasting. Michael's recorded statement in response, played on television in December of that year, is a strange document, by turns defensive, wounded, and eerily calm. The statement of a man who has clearly decided that the only defense available to him is insistence. The Chandler family enters Michael's orbit in the way that many families entered it during this period. Through a chance encounter, Michael's characteristic openness to new people when they arrived without the specific quality of want that he could detect from most adults at considerable distance, and a developing closeness that his critics and defenders have described in entirely different registers. Michael invited children to Neverland regularly. This is not a contested fact. He described it himself as a deliberate choice. A man who had not had a childhood, creating a space where children could have what he hadn't, and sharing in it. Whether this was the complete truth or a partial truth or a rationalization is the question that has not been and may never be definitively answered. The investigation is extensive and invasive in ways that Michael, by his own account and by the account of those around him, found deeply traumatic. He is strip-searched by police, a process that he described as the single most humiliating experience of his life, conducted, as he put it, to photograph his body for comparison against a description provided by the accuser. He gives a statement that is defiant and detailed. He then cancels the remainder of the Dangerous World Tour, checks into a rehabilitation facility, and disappears from public life for several months. The civil settlement in January of 1994 is, in the legal and public relations sense, a catastrophe. Settling a case of this nature without admission of wrongdoing is standard practice in civil law, when the cost and uncertainty of trial exceeds the cost of resolution. It is also, in the court of public opinion, functionally indistinguishable from an admission. Michael knew this. His advisors knew this. They settled anyway, reportedly against Michael's explicit wishes, because the alternative, a trial, carried its own set of risks that his legal team was not willing to run. The district attorney investigates for months, interviews dozens of witnesses, and in September of 1994 declines to file charges due to insufficient evidence. The public largely does not update its view in response to this development. The settled amount is the number that stays. In May of 1994, Michael Jackson married Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of Elvis Presley, which is the kind of sentence that requires a moment of quiet respect for how strange the universe is willing to get. They had met years earlier. They had stayed in contact. After the 1993 allegations and the settlement, Lisa Marie, by her own account, believed in Michael's innocence and agreed to marry him. The marriage lasted approximately 20 months and generated a level of media skepticism that both parties found exhausting and, by several accounts, insulting. At the MTV Video Music Awards in 1994, they kissed on stage in a moment that was clearly designed to demonstrate to the world that this was real, and the world, with some accuracy, remained unconvinced. The son of Elvis Presley and the son of Joe Jackson sitting across from each other at a dinner table is already the premise of a novel that writes itself. Lisa Marie had grown up inside the machinery of the most famous name in American popular music, had watched it consume her father, had spent decades managing her own identity in the shadow of a mythology that she had not chosen and could not escape. The parallels with Michael's situation were not metaphorical. They were structural. Two people formed by the most extreme version of a particular experience, meeting at the point where that experience had become, in different ways, unbearable. Lisa Marie said, in interviews given after the marriage ended and after Michael's death, that her feelings for him were genuine, that she loved him, that she believed he was innocent, and that she thought she could, in some sense, save him. The saving impulse is recognizable and human, and, as she acknowledges in retrospect, not a sound basis for a marriage. Michael, for his part, appears to have found in her something he rarely had access to. Someone who spoke to him with complete directness, who was not employed by him, and who was capable of disagreeing with him in terms he couldn't simply redirect or defer. He was not always comfortable with this, but he kept calling her back. The MTV kiss is, in fairness, one of the more uncomfortable artifacts of 1990s celebrity culture. Two people performing spontaneity for an audience of millions with the particular quality of discomfort that descends when everyone in the room knows exactly what is happening, and the people doing it know that everyone knows and are going ahead with it anyway. Michael says, into the microphone, "And just think, nobody thought this would last." The line is either charming or painful, depending on where you're sitting and what you know about what comes next. They divorce in 1996, 18 months after the marriage. Lisa Marie describes the separation as something she initiated. Michael does not contest this publicly. He calls her for years afterward. She takes the calls. History, past, present, and future. Book 1, released in 1995, is one of the stranger artistic responses to personal crisis in the history of popular music. It is a double album, the first disc of which is a greatest hits compilation, and the second disc of which contains 15 new songs ranging from genuine emotional vulnerability to barely veiled defiance to a spoken word piece in which Michael describes himself as a victim with the conviction of a man who has prepared extensively for this exact speech. It also contains Scream, a duet with his sister Janet that begins with the two of them on a spaceship, apparently fleeing Earth and its unreasonable demands. It shipped 9 million copies in its first week. The marketing campaign included a statue of Michael Jackson, 9 stories tall, floated down the River Thames on a barge. Nobody in his organisation seemed to find this proportionate. The history campaign is worth dwelling on because it is, as a piece of communication strategy, genuinely fascinating in its confidence that scale is the appropriate response to scandal. The statue, 9 stories of Michael Jackson in military jacket, hand extended, chin lifted, expression resolute, was produced in 5 copies and floated down major European rivers as a promotional stunt for the album. It was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. The implicit argument of the 9-story statue is that a man guilty of what he was accused of would not float a 9-story statue of himself down the Thames, because the proportion of that action to the scale of the accusation is so extreme that it functions as its own kind of proof. This is, as a legal argument, without merit. As a piece of theatre, it is extraordinary. The album itself is divided between the two modes Michael inhabits during this period: the private grief and the public indignation, both present, rarely in the same song. You Are Not Alone, which was written by R. Kelly and which Michael delivers with a nakedness that makes the song's origin slightly uncomfortable in retrospect, reaches number 1 on the Billboard chart in its first week, becoming the first song in history to debut at number 1. This is, commercially, a remarkable achievement for an album released in the shadow of a settlement and a media cycle that had spent 2 years doing its level best to reduce him to a single story. Tabloid Junkie and Scream are the defiant tracks, and they are specific in their targets in a way that Michael's music rarely was before this period. He is naming the press. He is naming the process. He is, for the first time in his recording career, making songs that are not addressed to a lover or to an audience but to his accusers, and the anger in them is genuine enough that it slightly destabilizes the listening experience. You're not quite sure whether you're hearing art or a deposition. Both, probably. Most true things about Michael Jackson turned out to be both. Michael Jackson's second marriage, to dermatologist's assistant Debbie Rowe in November of 1996, was arranged in circumstances that have been described charitably as unconventional and uncharitably in ways that legal agreements have complicated. Debbie Rowe carried 2 of Michael's children, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., known as Prince, born in 1997, and Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, born in 1998. Before the marriage ended in divorce and she relinquished custody. A third child, Prince Michael II, later known as Blanket and now as Biggie, was born in 2000 via surrogate. The children grew up at Neverland in conditions that were lavish by any material standard and deeply peculiar by almost every other standard, their faces covered in public by veils and masks, their education conducted largely at home, their world bounded by the gates of a property that was simultaneously a paradise and a kind of elaborately decorated isolation. Debbie Rowe had worked for Michael's dermatologist Arnold Klein for years and knew Michael through that professional relationship. She was a direct, plain-spoken woman who seemed to occupy a different emotional register entirely from most of the people in Michael's orbit, not dazzled by him, not managing him, not angling for proximity to his fame, simply present in the way that people who work in medical offices are present, which is to say practically and without ceremony. When Michael expressed a desire for children and the conventional routes to that outcome appeared complicated by the state of his public life, Debbie Rowe made an offer. She has described it in those terms, an offer made out of genuine affection and a desire to give him something he wanted. The marriage was the legal structure built around the arrangement. Whether this was a love marriage in any recognizable sense is a question both parties have answered differently at different points in time, and the honest answer is probably that it contained elements of both genuine affection and practical architecture in proportions that shifted depending on the year. What is clear is that Michael was, from the moment his children arrived, a father in the most total sense available to him. He was present. He was involved. He arranged their lives with the same attention to detail he brought to everything: the tutors, the schedules, the carefully controlled environment of Neverland, the masks and veils in public that were designed to give them some fraction of the anonymity he had never had. The masks are the detail that the press finds most alarming and that Michael finds most explicable. He has never in his life been able to walk through a public space without his image being captured and distributed. He has never been able to be seen without the seeing becoming an event. He does not want this for his children. He wants them to be able to exist, briefly, in the world outside Neverland, without the specific violence of a camera lens determining what their faces mean to strangers before they have had a chance to determine it themselves. The masks are impractical, visually arresting in a way that draws exactly the attention they are meant to deflect, and completely sincere. This combination is very Michael Jackson. Prince, Paris and Blanket grow up knowing that their father is the most famous person alive in the specific way that children know extraordinary facts about their parents, as ambient background information, not fully processed, simply there. Paris has spoken in interviews, given in the years after Michael's death, about a childhood that was genuinely happy inside its unusual parameters, the rides at Neverland, the films in the theatre, her father's physical presence and emotional availability. She's also spoken about the abruptness with which that world ended. Both things are true, and she holds them both with a composure that is, in its quiet way, recognisable. In November of 2002, Michael Jackson stood on a hotel balcony in Berlin and held his infant son Blanket over the railing, above a crowd of fans gathered in the street below, for a period of several seconds before pulling the child back. The images went around the world before he was back inside. The explanation offered afterward, that it was a spontaneous response to a crowd asking to see the baby, was received with the kind of silence that typically follows an explanation that has not quite done the job it was asked to do. Michael seemed genuinely surprised by the intensity of the reaction. This is perhaps the most interesting part. He had been living in a reality so particular to himself for so long that the gap between what seemed normal to him and what seemed normal to the rest of the world had become, in some instances, functionally unbridgeable. You're staying at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, which is a hotel of sufficient grandeur that staying at the Hotel Adlon functions as its own kind of statement. Below your balcony, several hundred fans have gathered because word has spread that you are there, as word always spreads, with a speed and reliability that attends everything connected to your existence. The fans want to see you. You're holding a 9-month-old child. The impulse to show the fans the child, to share him, in the way you share everything with the people who love you from the street below is, in the logic of your life as you've been living it for 44 years, a natural one. You hold the child over the railing. The child is wearing a cloth over his face. You hold him there for a moment, showing him to the crowd the way you might show someone a precious thing you're proud of. Then you bring him back in. The images, taken from below at an angle that emphasizes the height of the balcony and the smallness of the infant, go around the world in hours. The framing of the images is not neutral. The distance from the ground, estimated at around 50 feet, is included in every caption. Child welfare organizations issue statements. Government officials in several countries make remarks. Piers Morgan, who at this point in history is a tabloid editor rather than a television personality, is particularly vocal, which is either relevant or ironic depending on your view of Piers Morgan's subsequent career trajectory. Michael apologizes. He says it was a mistake, a momentary lapse of judgment, that he would never endanger his child. He seems, in the statement, genuinely baffled by the distance between his intention and the world's interpretation, the bafflement of a man for whom the internal logic of an action was so clear that the external reading of it hadn't occurred to him as a possibility until the external reading arrived, loudly and from all directions simultaneously. Blanket, now Biggie, has spoken briefly in adult interviews about his childhood and his father. He describes Michael as loving and present. He does not appear to carry any particular residue of the balcony incident, which is either evidence that it was as benign in experience as Michael maintained, or simply evidence that a 9-month-old has no memory of a November night in Berlin. both are probably true, and the incident remains, in the long catalogue of Michael Jackson moments that defy single-sentence summary, one of the more genuinely difficult ones to file. In November of 2003, a documentary by British journalist Martin Bashir aired in the United States under the title Living with Michael Jackson. In it, Michael held hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arvizo and described sharing his bedroom with children as the most loving thing an adult could do, which was either a statement of breathtaking naivety or something else entirely, and the question of which became the defining legal event of his later life. He was arrested in November 2003 on charges of child molestation. The trial lasted 5 months. In June 2005, after a deliberation of 7 days, the jury acquitted Michael Jackson on all 14 counts. He left the courtroom in a manner that suggested a man who'd been somewhere very far away for a very long time and was not entirely certain he had come back. The Bashir documentary is one of the stranger documents in the history of celebrity journalism, and it is strange in multiple directions simultaneously. Bashir spent 8 months with Michael at Neverland, travelling in recording sessions, and the access he was granted was extraordinary by any standard. The kind of access that is only extended by someone who believes, with genuine confidence, that being known is the same as being understood. Michael believed this. He'd been misunderstood for so long in so many directions that the prospect of a documentary that would simply show him as he was struck him as self-evidently clarifying. He's seen in the film at his most unguarded, shopping for antiques, discussing his children, explaining his views on childhood and innocence with the particular quality of someone who has thought about these things alone for a very long time and is now, perhaps unwisely, thinking about them out loud on camera. The hand-holding moment with Gavin Arvizo and the statement about bedroom sharing that accompanies it are the moments the documentary builds toward, whether deliberately or not. Michael delivers the statement with complete sincerity and zero apparent awareness that it requires any qualification. He is not performing innocence. He genuinely does not understand why the statement would not be received as the straightforward declaration of warmth he intends it to be. This is either the most comprehensive failure of self-awareness in the history of public statements, or evidence of something else, and the trial that follows is the legal system's attempt to determine which. The trial runs from January to June of 2005 in Santa Maria, California. The prosecution presents testimony from Gavin Arvizo and his family. The defense presents evidence that substantially complicates the credibility of the accusers, including documentation suggesting that the Arvizo family had a history of making accusations against third parties for financial gain. The jury, after deliberating for 7 days, returns not guilty verdicts on all 14 counts, including the conspiracy charge. This is a comprehensive acquittal, not a split verdict, not a hung jury, but 14 not guilty findings from 12 jurors who had heard all of the evidence. Michael leaves the courthouse in white. He goes to Neverland. He does not stay long. The ranch that was supposed to be his sanctuary has been searched by police, photographed, and discussed in detail in open court. He sleeps there a handful of times, then leaves, and does not return as a resident. He is 46 years old. He has been the subject of 2 criminal investigations, 1 civil settlement, and a media cycle of approximately 12 years unbroken duration. He boards a plane and goes somewhere else, and the specific quality of exhaustion on his face in the photographs taken as he departs is the kind of exhaustion that a full night's sleep was not going to address. After the acquittal, Michael Jackson left the United States and did not return for several years. He went first to Bahrain as a guest of Sheikh Abdullah al-Hamad al-Khalifa, one of the sons of the King of Bahrain, who had expressed a desire to collaborate on music and had offered Michael refuge in the most literal sense, a compound, staff, security, and a level of privacy that California had long since ceased to provide. He stayed for months. He moved to Ireland briefly. He settled eventually in Las Vegas, living in a rented mansion, reportedly spending considerable time watching old films and calling his children into the screening room to watch them together. He was, by accounts from those who saw him during this period, quieter than he had been before. He was also, by those same accounts, increasingly dependent on the anesthetics and sedatives that would eventually form the operational centre of his final years. Bahrain in 2005 receives Michael Jackson the way it receives most things, with a particular combination of discretion and lavishness that is specific to certain kinds of Gulf hospitality, and that for someone whose American life had become ungovernable in its exposure, must have felt like a physical pressure being released. The Sheikh is a genuine music enthusiast, not merely a wealthy man acquiring a famous person for novelty. He and Michael discuss projects. They record some material. There is talk of an album, a label deal, a creative partnership. None of it formally materializes in the way either party hopes, and the subsequent years produce a lawsuit over the arrangement that Michael eventually settles, adding another legal chapter to a biography already carrying more legal chapters than most people's full lives. Ireland comes next, and the choice of Ireland is its own kind of detail, a country whose relationship to privacy, at least in its rural registers, is sufficiently robust that a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses has a reasonable chance of moving through it without generating a news cycle. Michael rents a property on the outskirts of a village and does something he has not been able to do in years, which is approximately nothing. He takes his children to the local shop. He's recognised, but the specific quality of Irish recognition, which tends toward a nod and a decision to let a person alone, serves him better than California recognition, which tends toward a phone call to a celebrity news outlet. Las Vegas is the final stop before his return to the United States in any operational sense, and it suits him in the way that Vegas suits people who want to be anonymous in plain sight. This city is organised around spectacle, which means that any individual piece of spectacle, even Michael Jackson renting a mansion, being driven through the strip, dissolves into the general noise without leaving a particular mark. He takes his children to theme parks and magic shows. He is seen at a few restaurants. He looks, in photographs from this period, thin in a way that is medically significant, and that people around him are beginning to find alarming. The quiet of the post-trial years is not the quiet of a man at rest. It is the quiet of a man conserving something that is running low. Michael Jackson was, at various points in his life, one of the wealthiest entertainers on earth. He was also, by the final decade of his life, in a financial situation that required a remarkable amount of creative management to avoid characterizing accurately. Neverland alone cost approximately $5 million per year to maintain, and for years after it ceased to function as a home, that maintenance continued. There were loans taken against the ATV music catalogue, the publishing rights he had famously purchased in 1985 for $47 million, a catalogue that included most of the Beatles' back catalogue, and that was, and remains, genuinely staggering in its value. There were lawsuits, settlements, business ventures, managers who may or may not have served his interests competently, and the general financial physics of a life lived at a scale that had essentially no precedent. Spending at the level Michael Jackson spent requires some unpacking, because the numbers involved reach a point of abstraction that the ordinary mind processes as simply a lot without registering the specific texture of it. There are accounts from this period of shopping trips in which Michael acquired antiques, furniture, paintings, and decorative objects at a pace that caused the shops to run out of wrapping paper. There are accounts of staff numbers at Neverland that, during peak operation, ran to approximately 100 people employed full-time to maintain a property that one man and 3 children lived in. There are accounts of the flower budget alone, which was, by multiple reports, substantial enough to represent a meaningful annual income for a person in a different tax bracket. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of the arithmetic. When income is vast and expenditure is vaster, the gap between them does not close through cultural significance or critical legacy or the sheer accumulated force of talent. It closes through money, of which there eventually is not enough, or through loans, of which there eventually are too many. Michael took loans against the ATV catalogue, which was itself a kind of financial surrealism, borrowing against an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars in order to fund a lifestyle that was consuming tens of millions per year. The whole arrangement balanced on the assumption that the income would eventually return to the level it had been during the touring years. The income did not return. The Invincible album in 2001 sells modestly by Michael Jackson standards, 8 million copies, which for any other artist represents an extraordinary career achievement, and which for Michael represents a commercial disappointment severe enough to generate a public dispute with his record label that produces the spectacle of him standing outside Sony's offices holding a sign. The spectacle does not improve the sales figures. The financial situation continues to develop. By the mid-2000s, Michael is significantly in debt to a small number of creditors, the most significant of which is a bank holding loans secured against the catalogue. The interest accumulates, the properties require maintenance, the staff must be paid, and Michael, somewhere in a rented house in Las Vegas or Bahrain or a village in Ireland, continues spending at a rate that suggests either a belief that the situation will correct itself or an inability to reduce a lifestyle that is, at this point, essentially the only mode of existence he knows how to operate in. In 1985, Michael Jackson purchased ATV Music, publishing for $47.5 million, outbidding Paul McCartney, who'd been warned by McCartney's then-friend Michael Jackson that if an opportunity came to buy the catalogue, he should take it, advice McCartney had evidently assumed was theoretical. The catalogue contained approximately 250 Beatles songs, among other holdings. It was, by any reasonable analysis, an extraordinary acquisition, not merely financially but symbolically, representing one of the stranger moments in which the mechanics of the music industry intersected with the mechanics of an already quite strange friendship. McCartney's public comments on the subject over the following years range from diplomatic to barely concealed irritation. The catalogue is now worth, depending on the year and the valuation methodology, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. To understand what Michael Jackson did when he bought ATV, you have to understand that in 1985 the idea of a musician purchasing the rights to other musicians' songs was not the standard financial strategy it would later become. Artists were not, as a rule, in the business of owning publishing. They wrote songs, recorded them, and the rights lived somewhere else, with the label, with the publisher, with a corporate entity that had no particular relationship to the music beyond its value as an asset. McCartney himself had been told years earlier by his own former manager that he should buy publishing rights when the opportunity arose. McCartney had not bought his own catalogue when it came up for sale in the 1970s. He had bought other people's catalogues, which is a reasonable business decision, but not the one that would have mattered most. Michael is advised of the ATV opportunity by his attorney and by the music industry professionals around him who understand what the catalogue represents. He investigates it with the same focused thoroughness he applies to recording sessions, studying the holdings, the income streams, the terms of existing licensing agreements, the trajectory of the Beatles' commercial relevance in a world that is, in 1985, still processing the fact that John Lennon has been dead for 5 years, and the catalogue continues to generate income at a rate that most living artists would find aspirational. He pays $47.5 million, which in 1985 represents approximately 1 year of the income he is generating from Thriller and its associated touring and licensing. The deal closes. McCartney is informed by Michael over the phone, and the conversation is not recorded but has been described by McCartney in terms that make clear he was not delighted. Michael is reported to have been apologetic and also to have declined to reverse the purchase. These two stances are not contradictory. They're just Michael. The catalogue is later merged with Sony's publishing arm to form Sony/ATV, giving Michael a 50% stake in one of the largest music publishing companies in the world. He borrows against this stake to manage his debt in later years. After his death, the estate sells the Sony/ATV stake for $750 million. The $47.5 million investment, held for 30 years, returns roughly 16 times its purchase price. It is, by any measure, the most consequential financial decision in the history of popular music, and it began with Michael Jackson taking his own advice more seriously than his friend did. The propofol is the end of the story, but the story began much earlier. Michael Jackson's relationship with prescription medication is documented, contested, and in some dimensions genuinely difficult to establish with precision, but the broad outline is clear. Beginning with the painkillers prescribed after the Pepsi fire in 1984, and continuing through the back surgery of 1993, and the subsequent dependency that required a stay at a rehabilitation facility, there was a recurring pattern of need, treatment, relapse, and the particular vulnerability of a man who was both enormously powerful and deeply susceptible to the opinions of the people he trusted. By the mid-2000s, those around him were regularly managing access to the substances he required to sleep, to perform, to function. The doctor he employed in the final months of his life administered propofol, an anesthetic used in clinical settings as a sleep aid, every night in a rented mansion in Los Angeles. The sleep problem, which has been present since at least the early 1990s in documented form, is the through line that connects all of it. Michael cannot sleep. This is not a preference or a habit or a personality quirk. It is a condition, a genuine, chronic, medically significant inability to enter and sustain ordinary sleep, and it exists most likely because the brain that made everything he made does not easily agree to turn itself off. The same hypervigilance that processes a snare sound and finds it 1 degree imprecise, the same sensitivity that can walk into a room and read its emotional temperature in seconds, the same quality of attention that made him extraordinary. This is not a system that parks itself neatly at the end of the day and waits for morning. The people who treat him over the years are dealing with a patient who is simultaneously easy to manage and impossible to refuse. He is cooperative, articulate about his symptoms, genuinely grateful for relief when it comes. He's also the most famous person his doctors have ever treated, which creates a specific dynamic in which the ordinary medical calculus, the careful weighing of benefit against dependency risk, the frank conversation about long-term consequences becomes harder to conduct when one party to the conversation has been told yes by essentially everyone in his professional life for 40 years. Dr. Conrad Murray is hired in 2009 to serve as Michael's personal physician during the This Is It tour preparation. He is paid $150,000 per month. He is not a sleep specialist. He is not an anesthesiologist. He is a cardiologist who has agreed to administer, nightly, a drug that requires clinical monitoring equipment and trained staff and a crash cart on standby in a residential setting to help one man sleep. He does this for approximately 2 months. On the night of June 24th, 2009, something goes wrong in the monitoring, the dosage, or the timing. Michael does not wake up. Murray is convicted of involuntary manslaughter in 2011 and serves 2 years in prison. He has maintained, in interviews given since his release, that he does not believe he did anything wrong. The California Medical Board disagreed and revoked his license permanently. In March of 2009, Michael Jackson stood on the stage of the O2 Arena in London and announced that he would be performing 50 concerts, beginning in July, under the title This Is It. He had not toured in 12 years. He was 50 years old. He was, depending on who you asked and when you asked them, in either reasonable health or alarming health, a disagreement that the existence of subsequent rehearsal footage does not entirely resolve, because the rehearsal footage is remarkable and terrible in equal measure, a document of a man who still had everything, and was also visibly running on something that was not sustainable. He called it his final curtain. The phrase was, in a way that none of them intended, accurate. The announcement press conference at the O2 is one of the more charged pieces of footage from Michael Jackson's final year, and it is charged in a direction that is difficult to name precisely. He walks out onto the stage in front of a crowd of fans and journalists, and he is thin, noticeably, significantly thin, in the way that registers not as a fashion choice but as a medical observation. He is wearing a military jacket. He punches the air. He says the words, "This is it," with a theatrical emphasis that is either genuine excitement or a very well-executed version of genuine excitement. The crowd responds with an intensity that is, as always with Michael Jackson crowds, somewhat alarming in its completeness. The 50 concerts sell out in hours. Then the promoters, reading the demand correctly, add more. The final count reaches 50 concerts at the O2, scheduled across several months, representing the largest single-venue concert commitment in the history of the venue, and one of the most commercially significant tour announcements in the history of the industry. Michael's cut of the revenue, if all 50 shows had been performed, would have been sufficient to resolve his financial situation entirely and then some. The tour is not just a comeback. It is, in financial terms, a rescue operation conducted in sequins and smoke machines. Rehearsals begin at a warehouse in Burbank in April and move to the Staples Center in Los Angeles in May. The footage captured during these sessions is what becomes the documentary This Is It, released 4 months after Michael's death to an audience that watches it with a specific quality of attention. Not the attention you bring to a concert film, but the attention you bring to something that is simultaneously a record of creative brilliance and a document of something ending. Michael in these rehearsals is working. He is present, specific, demanding, and generous by turns. He's teaching choreography and demonstrating vocal runs and making decisions about lighting states with the authority of a director who knows exactly what he is building. He is also, in moments between songs, sitting quietly in the wings with an expression that is hard to read and that nobody apparently asked about directly. He dies 6 weeks before the first show. Michael Jackson died at 10:50 in the morning, Pacific Time, on June 25th, 2009, in a rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, California. He was 50 years old. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, administered propofol and sedatives in the early hours of the morning in an attempt to help Michael sleep. At some point after Murray left the room, Michael stopped breathing. By the time Murray returned and began attempting resuscitation, too much time had passed. He was transported to UCLA Medical Center and pronounced dead at 2:26 in the afternoon. The cause of death was listed as acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication. Conrad Murray was subsequently convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served 2 years in prison. The day Michael Jackson died, the internet, in its current form, largely collapsed under the weight of the traffic. People had to check multiple sources because they did not quite believe it. Then they believed it. The Carrollwood Drive mansion is not Neverland. It is a rented property, 6 bedrooms, adequately grand, not his. Michael has been renting it since returning to Los Angeles to prepare for the tour, and the temporariness of it is part of the texture of this period in his life. A man between homes, between identities almost. The Neverland chapter definitively closed, and the next chapter scheduled to begin in July at the O2. The mansion has the quality of a staging area. The furniture is not his. The art on the walls is not his. His children sleep in rooms that were decorated by someone else for some other purpose. He goes to bed in the early hours of June 25th after a rehearsal that runs, as rehearsals do, long into the night. Murray gives him a series of sedatives, lorazepam, midazolam, over the course of several hours, none of which produce sleep. Then propofol, administered through an IV, the drug that reliably sends Michael across the threshold that everything else fails to reach. Murray leaves the room at some point. The monitoring equipment, which should be present, which is not present, would have detected the change in Michael's breathing. There is no monitoring equipment. When Murray returns, Michael is not breathing. He calls for help after a delay whose precise length is established in court and is longer than it should have been. Paramedics arrive and begin resuscitation. Michael is loaded into an ambulance and taken to UCLA Medical Center, where a team works on him for an hour before the attending physician calls it. His children are in the house. They are told by a staff member. Paris, 11 years old, is present in the hospital. She's later described by those who were there as inconsolable, in the specific, total way of a child for whom the thing that has happened is simply too large. The internet that afternoon fails in a way it has not failed before and has not failed since. In quite the same way, Twitter goes down, Google's news servers return errors, TMZ's site crashes under load. The news travels at a speed that the infrastructure of 2009 is not built to carry. People all over the world stop what they are doing and do the thing people do when they need to confirm something. They do not want to be true, which is check again, and then check again, and then sit with it. Here is what remains. The music remains. Not abstractly, not archivally, but actively. Heard daily in grocery stores and car radios and the earbud of someone on a train. Somewhere who has just, for the first time, actually listened to the bass line on Billie Jean and stopped what they were doing to attend to it. The dance remains, documented in footage that repays repeated viewing without diminishment, the way great paintings do. The cultural weight remains, an argument, unresolved, about what we owe to genius and what genius does not excuse, about childhood and what is done to children who are given extraordinary gifts and then expected to survive them. And somewhere at the centre of it all, harder to locate and harder to dismiss than any of the above, is the person, the specific, strange, gifted, damaged, searching person who wanted more than almost anything else to be understood, and who died in a rented house in a city that had made him and then eaten him alive, still trying to get some sleep. The music first, because it is the clearest and least contested part of what he left, and because it continues to do the thing it was made to do, which is move people physically in the body, the way music moves people when it is working at the level it is supposed to work. Thriller is 40 years old and it does not sound dated. Off the Wall sounds, if anything, more sophisticated with distance. Billie Jean has been analysed by more music theorists, covered by more artists, and sampled more times than perhaps any single pop song of its era, and it still arrives, when you hear it unexpectedly, with the specific force of something that knows exactly what it is doing. The recorded body of work is not a nostalgia object, it is a living document. The dance is a separate legacy and deserves separate mention. The footage of Michael Jackson performing, the Motown 25th anniversary, the Bad Tour, the Dangerous Tour, the Super Bowl halftime show in 1993, the Rehearsal tapes, represents a standard of physical performance that the subsequent decades of popular music have not produced an equivalent to. This is not sentiment. It is technical observation. The integration of musicality and movement, the precision of the footwork, the quality of presence, these are specific skills practiced to a level of mastery that is visible in the footage and that professional dancers and choreographers reference as a benchmark. You can disagree about Michael Jackson on many grounds. The dancing is not one of the grounds. What is harder, and what the legacy will be processing for a long time, is the question of the person underneath the work. The child in Gary who was never allowed a childhood. The man who built a ranch and named it after a place where children don't grow up. The artist who made work of extraordinary beauty and lived a life of extraordinary difficulty, and whose private conduct remains, for a significant number of people, a source of genuine moral uncertainty. These things do not resolve into a clean verdict. They sit alongside each other, the way complicated things sit, not cancelling each other out, not waiting to be solved, simply coexisting in the way that the full truth of a person's life tends to coexist with the simplified version the world prefers. He wanted to be understood. He said this in interviews, in songs, in a documentary that he allowed to be filmed because he believed visibility was the same as comprehension. He was wrong about that. In the specific case of Martin Bashir and in the general case of what fame does to the space between a person and the world's idea of them. The world did not understand him. It's not clear the world was capable of it. What the world has instead is everything he made, the songs, the films, the performances, the footwork, and the unresolved question of who made them, which is a question that gets more interesting, not less, with every year that passes. The boy from Gary, Indiana, who couldn't stop performing from the moment he could walk, who was handed extraordinary gifts and an extraordinary bill for them, who built himself a world and then lost it, who wanted more than anything to give children what he hadn't had, and about whom the world could not agree on what that meant. That person is gone. What he left is not a monument or a verdict. It is a body of work that keeps moving, and the sound of a bass line heard unexpectedly that makes you stop what you're doing, which is, in the end, what he always wanted. To make you stop, to make you feel something, to make you just for a moment pay attention. He was very good at that. He was the best there has ever been at that. And whatever else is true, that part holds. Let's talk about God, because God is in this story from the very beginning and never quite leaves. Katherine Jackson raised her children as Jehovah's Witnesses, with the sincerity of someone for whom the faith was not a weekend obligation, but a complete operating system, a framework for understanding the world, managing fear, and explaining suffering in terms that gave it a shape rather than leaving it formless. No Christmas, no birthdays, no blood transfusions, no voting, no celebration of any holiday that the Watchtower Society had determined was of pagan origin, which covered considerable ground. For 9 children in a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, the faith was simply the weather, always present, unquestioned, the texture of daily life. Michael absorbed it the way children absorb everything in a household, where the same thing is true every single day, completely below the level of argument, all the way down. The door-to-door preaching is the detail that tends to stop people when they hear it for the first time. Michael Jackson, the Michael Jackson, the one with the moonwalk and the sequined glove and the zombie choreography, knocked on strangers' doors as a teenager and offered them copies of the Watchtower magazine. He did this reportedly wearing a disguise, a fake beard, a hat, a coat. He was already famous enough that appearing at someone's door as himself would have transformed the theological visit into something else entirely. So he went in costume, which is either a picture of genuine religious commitment or the most Michael Jackson possible way to practice a faith, authentic intention, theatrical execution, the two things so intertwined by that point that separating them was probably not possible even for him. The witness's theology left specific marks on his imagination that are audible in the work. The language of sin and redemption, of a watchful divine presence who sees everything and records everything, of a world that is fundamentally fallen and requiring transformation. This is the grammar underneath songs like Man in the Mirror, Will You Be There, Heal the World. These are not secular songs wearing religious clothing. They are songs written by someone who genuinely believes the world can be redeemed, and that individual moral reckoning is the mechanism of that redemption. The belief is sincere. You can hear the difference between sincere religious feeling and performance of religious feeling, and Michael's is the former, completely. The faith also provided from childhood a very specific relationship to guilt. Jehovah's Witness theology is not gentle about transgression. Sin is real, consequence is real, judgment is real, and the distance between acceptable behavior and damnation is maintained by constant vigilance and regular confession to the congregation's elders. For a child who was also performing in nightclubs, being exposed to the full adult machinery of the music industry, and living a life that bore essentially no resemblance to the modest, separated from the world existence the faith prescribed, the dissonance must have been structural and constant. Michael carried it. It shows up in the perfectionism, the sense that getting something wrong is not merely a professional failure, but something closer to a moral one. It shows up in the insomnia, in the anxiety that preceded performances, in the quality of self-scrutiny that made him watch his own playback with the expression of a man looking for evidence of something. He was formally disfellowshipped, effectively excommunicated in the mid-1980s, following the release of the Thriller video. The church objected to the occult imagery. Michael responded by adding a disclaimer at the start of the video clarifying that the film did not reflect his personal beliefs regarding the occult. The church was not satisfied. The disfellowshipping severed the formal relationship, but it did not sever the internalized one. The God of Michael Jackson's childhood remained in residence for the rest of his life, not always comforting, not always kind, but present, watching, keeping a record. Michael prayed. He prayed before shows, prayed in private, prayed with his children. He had been taught that God was always in the room. He never fully stopped believing it. Let's talk about Paul McCartney and about the specific afternoon in the early 1980s when two of the most famous musicians who have ever lived sat together at a piano and Paul McCartney, meaning it as general advice, told Michael Jackson that buying music publishing rights was the smartest thing a musician could do because the money never stopped, the asset appreciated, and the artist who owned the songs owned the future. McCartney was speaking from experience and from a position of moderate regret, having failed to purchase his own catalogue when the opportunity arose. Michael listened with the focused, unhurried quality he brought to conversations that interested him, asked several precise questions, and filed the information away in the place where he kept things that mattered. A few years later, he used it. McCartney, receiving the news that Michael had purchased ATV, and with it the rights to most of the Beatles' songs, described the experience in interviews over subsequent decades with a diplomatic consistency that masked rather thinly the fact that he found it somewhere between unfortunate and genuinely galling. He had, in a meaningful sense, given Michael the idea. This is the kind of story that is funny until it involves your songs. The McCartney-Jackson friendship is worth understanding in its warmer years, before the publishing acquisition permanently altered its temperature, because it was genuinely unusual and genuinely warm in ways that both men described with a lack of irony that is itself notable. They met through the music industry in the early 1980s and discovered, in the way that people with rare and specific gifts sometimes discover each other, that the conversation was easy, not because they were alike exactly, but because they were operating at a similar altitude and the view from up there is only shared by a very small number of people at any given time in history. McCartney was 40, Michael was 22. The gap in age and experience was considerable. The gap in mutual recognition was not. They recorded together twice in the early 80s. The Girl Is Mine, a duet released on Thriller in 1982, is a gentle, melodically elegant song about two men competing for the same woman's affection, and it proceeds with the particular courtesy of a recording made between two people who like each other and are not trying to outshine each other, which produces something charming and slightly low stakes for material from what would become the best-selling album in history. Say, released in 1983, is the more substantial collaboration, a full production, with a short film to accompany it, the two of them clearly enjoying themselves in a way that comes through in the recording. McCartney has spoken warmly about the sessions in interviews given before the publishing dispute became the dominant frame for the friendship. He describes Michael as funny, attentive, and possessed of an ear that caught things in the mix that most people would have missed completely. The publishing advice is given in this period of warmth and mutual enjoyment, and its sincerity is not in question. McCartney genuinely believed what he said. He was not setting a trap. He was sharing knowledge with someone he considered a friend and a colleague, the way people share knowledge when they're in a good mood and the conversation is going well. The knowledge happened to be extremely actionable, and Michael happened to act on it with a speed and decisiveness that McCartney had not anticipated. The lesson, that advice given freely, can be used in ways that are entirely unforeseen and not entirely welcome, is one of the older ones available, and it arrived, in this instance, in the form of a $47 million transaction that made Michael Jackson the owner of Yesterday, Let It Be, Hey Jude, and approximately 247 other songs that Paul McCartney had written, and would have preferred to own himself. They remained in contact after the acquisition, more or less. McCartney's public position was diplomatic for years, a version of it's just business delivered with the expression of a man for whom it was not entirely just business. Michael did not seem to understand, for some time, why McCartney was less warm than he had been, which is either evidence of genuine obliviousness or evidence that Michael had decided quite rationally that the acquisition was correct and the friendship would have to accommodate the decision rather than the other way around. Both of them spoke about each other with the careful language of people who have a complicated history and have agreed silently not to fully resolve it in public. The songs continue to generate royalties. The conversation about who owns what has not ended. It has simply moved into a different room, and so, here we are. At the end of a life that contained more in it than most lives could hold, more beauty, more strangeness, more scrutiny, more loneliness, more music than seems like a fair allocation for one person in one lifetime. You've travelled a long way tonight, from a 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, where a small boy watched his brothers rehearse and couldn't stop his body from joining in, all the way to a rented mansion in Holmby Hills, where the same person, older, quieter, still not sleeping, lay down for the last time with the O2 Arena 6 weeks away, and a bass line in his head that he would never finish working on. In between, there was a chimpanzee who met the mayor of Osaka. There was a 9-story statue floated down the Thames. There were 66 million copies of a single album, which is a number that stops meaning anything comprehensible after a certain point and simply becomes a fact about the universe. There were children in masks and a ranch with a working fire station and a friendship with Paul McCartney that was genuinely warm right up until it produced one of the most consequential business decisions in the history of recorded music. There was a man who knocked on strangers' doors in a fake beard, offering them pamphlets, because a faith absorbed in childhood does not leave when the circumstances change. It simply goes quiet and waits and prays in private long after the congregation has moved on. There was a voice. Let's not forget the voice. That particular combination of falsetto and hiccup and raw, unguarded feeling that managed, for 4 decades, to make millions of people in rooms they were standing in alone feel less alone. That is what music is supposed to do. Michael Jackson did it better than anyone else who's ever tried. He was not a simple person. He was not a clean story. He was a child who was given extraordinary gifts and an extraordinary bill for them, who spent his entire life trying to build in the space between the gift and the bill. Something that felt like home. He almost did it a few times. The music is the closest he got. Those minutes inside a song where the world as it actually was receded, and the world as he heard it, which was more beautiful and more redemptive and more worth the effort, came forward instead. So tonight, as you settle into your clean, quiet room, your unremarkable, blessedly ordinary room, with its ceiling that does not require staff to maintain, and its floor that belongs to you and no one else, maybe take a moment, not to judge, not to conclude, but simply to sit with the particular strangeness of a life that was lived at full volume in front of everyone by a person who wanted more than anything to be seen clearly. He wasn't, not really, not fully. But the music was. The music was seen exactly as it was, heard, felt, absorbed by millions of people who didn't need to understand the person to understand what he was trying to say. And the music, unlike everything else in this story, does not require resolution. It just plays. Let it play tonight, and sleep well.